somewhere between your 26th and your 34th birthday, a silent test takes place, one you never signed up for, one nobody warns you about, and most people fail it without ever realizing a test was happening at all. It is not a test of income. It is not a test of intelligence. It is a test of what you do in the exact moment you first suspect that the financial future you were promised is not the financial future you are going to get. Some people crumble in that moment. Some people numb themselves and stop paying attention entirely. And a very small number of people, in that same moment of dread, quietly begin building something completely different from everyone around them. This is the story of that moment, why it happens to almost everyone eventually, and why what you do inside it more than any single financial decision you will make for the next decade. Picture the scene, because you have probably lived some version of it already. You are lying awake, or scrolling through an app, or sitting in traffic doing math you did not intend to do, and a specific cold thought arrives uninvited. If I keep going exactly like this, saving what I save, earning what I earn, spending how I spend, I will still not have what my parents had at this age, or what I assumed I would have by now. Not mansion, not a private jet, just ordinary security, a paid-off home, a retirement that does not feel like a countdown to poverty, breathing room. That thought, small and unremarkable on the surface, is actually one of the most logically significant moments an adult experiences, because it marks the death of a story you were told before you were old enough to question it. That story deserves to be named clearly, because most people carry it without ever examining it. The story like this: work hard, be responsible, avoid excessive risk, and the system will reward you proportionally to your effort. It is a beautiful story. It is also, for a huge number of people alive today, no longer an accurate description of how the economy actually functions, and the gap between the story and the reality is exactly where that late-night dread comes from. To understand why this gap exists, you need to understand a shift that happened gradually, almost invisibly, across the last several decades. A shift economists sometimes call the decoupling of productivity and compensation. For a significant stretch of the previous century, when workers became more productive, when output per hour increased through better tools, better training, and better technology, wages tended alongside that productivity in a fairly direct relationship. Then, starting gradually and accelerating over time, that relationship broke. Productivity kept climbing. Wages, adjusted for what money can actually buy, largely stalled. The value being created by workers kept growing. The share of that value flowing back to the people creating it did not grow at the same pace. This is not a conspiracy theory or a political talking point. It is one of the most well-documented shifts in modern economic history, and is the invisible force sitting underneath that late-night feeling of running hard and staying in place. Here is the part almost nobody connects to their personal life, though. While wages stagnated relative to productivity, something else was happening simultaneously. And understanding this second shift is what actually unlocks the rest of this story. Capital, meaning ownership of assets like stocks, real estate, and businesses, kept generating returns that outpaced wage growth by a significant and widening margin. If your income came primarily from labor, from a paycheck, your financial position drifted slowly backward relative to the overall economy. If your income came primarily from capital, from ownership, your financial position surged forward. This single distinction, labor income versus capital income, is arguably the most important dividing line in modern personal finance, and almost nobody explains it to people before they turn 30, which means most people spend 20s optimizing entirely the wrong variable. Now, the instinct at this point is to feel a specific kind of anger, the sense that you were set up to fail by a system designed to extract your labor while quietly rewarding people who already owned things. That anger is not entirely misplaced. But anger alone is not a strategy, and this is where the story needs to shift from diagnosis to something more useful, because understanding a broken system without changing your behavior inside it accomplishes nothing except prolonged frustration. Let's travel in history for a moment, because this exact psychological crisis, the realization that the old rules no longer apply, has happened to entire generations before, and their responses offer a genuine roadmap. Consider the aftermath of major currency crises throughout the last century, moments when a nation's money lost a staggering portion of its value within a shockingly short window of time. In every documented case, you can observe two dramatically different reactions playing out simultaneously within the same population. A large majority, understandably shaken and confused, clung tight to the currency itself, trying to save harder, trying to hold on to cash, essentially trying to win a game using rules that had just been quietly rewritten without their knowledge. A much smaller group did things psychologically difficult, financially transformative. They stopped thinking of money as the goal and started thinking of money as a temporary tool for acquiring things that actually hold value, regardless of what any government does do with its currency, land, functioning businesses, productive equipment, ownership stakes in companies that make things people need regardless of economic conditions. When the dust settled, years later, the difference in outcomes between these two groups was not measured in small percentages. It was measured in entire generational trajectories, one group climbing back towards stability, the other group still recovering decades later. This history is not ancient trivia. It is a preview of a pattern that continues playing out today, just slower, quieter, and dressed up in more sophisticated language. Modern governments carrying enormous debt loads face essentially the same limits of choice that governments have always faced when debt becomes difficult to manage, and every one of those choices has consequences that eventually land on ordinary people, whether or not those people ever read a single economics textbook. Grow the economy fast enough to make the debt manageable relative to its size, historically slow and difficult to engineer on demand. Cut government spending or raise taxes aggressively enough to pay debt down directly, historically unpopular and rarely survives sustained political pressure. Default outright on obligations, historically catastrophic and almost never chosen by any government with alternatives remaining. Or the option history shows governments for again and again allow inflation to quietly shrink the real value of debt over time, a process that happens gradually enough that most citizens experience it as rising prices rather than recognizing it as a deliberate mechanism for managing government liabilities. This is the uncomfortable truth sitting beneath your grocery bill, beneath your rent increase, beneath the growing sense that your paycheck buys less than it used, even though the number on it keeps technically going up. Inflation is not simply an unfortunate side effect of a complicated economy. In many cases, it functions as a slow, largely invisible transfer of value, quietly shifting purchasing power away from people holding cash and fixed wages toward institutions and individuals holding debt and appreciating assets. Understanding this single mechanism reframes the entire late-night dread we started this story with. That feeling is not irrational anxiety. It is your intuition correctly detecting a real structural force, even before you have the vocabulary to name exactly what you are sensing. Once you see this clearly, a critical fork in the road appears, and how you respond at this fork genuinely determines which direction the next decade of your financial life moves. There are two dangerously tempting responses, and both feel emotionally satisfying in the moment while being financially destructive over time. The first is total resignation, deciding the game is unwinnable and shifting entirely toward short-term comfort spending, because if the future feels unreachable anyway, why sacrifice for it? The second is the opposite extreme, a kind of debt urgency that pushes people toward high-risk speculation, chasing rapid gains through volatile investments or unproven schemes, driven by a frantic need to catch up immediately rather than steadily. Both responses share the same root cause: fear making decisions that should be made by strategy, and financial history is filled with capable, intelligent people whose decade of progress was erased by a single fear-driven decision made in a moment exactly like the one we are describing. There is a third response, and it is deliberately unglamorous, which is precisely why it rarely gets discussed in flashy financial content designed to go viral. It begins not with a specific investment or a specific product, but with a reframed question. Instead of asking, why does this system feel unfair, which leads nowhere productive, the more useful question becomes, given how this system actually functions, where does value flow, and how do I position myself to be on the receiving end of that flow, rather than the paying end of it? This single reframe moves a person from passive frustration into active strategy, and it is the exact mental shift that separated the two groups in every historical currency crisis we discussed earlier. This is also the point in the story where market psychology deserves real attention, because it explains a pattern that confuses almost everyone the first time they truly understand it. During periods of genuine economic fear, when headlines are frightening and ordinary people are pulling back from anything that feels risky, asset prices frequently become temporarily undervalued, precisely because fear pushes sellers toward decisions driven by panic rather than by any careful calculation of long-term worth. This is not some secret insider phenomenon reserved for the wealthy. It is a repeating, well-documented pattern across nearly every major economic downturn in modern history. The people who consistently build long-term wealth are rarely the ones with privileged access to secret information. They are overwhelmingly the ones who understood that collective fear creates temporary mispricing, and who had built enough financial and emotional stability to act calmly while the majority around them were frozen or fleeing. Zoom out even further now, because this personal financial story does not exist in isolation from the wider world, no matter how disconnected it might feel from your daily life. Global power is currently undergoing a slow, uneven redistribution, a shift in which regions of the world hold the greatest manufacturing capacity, the greatest control over essential resources, and the greatest influence over global trade relationships. Every time in history that this kind of large-scale power redistribution has occurred, it has been accompanied by currency instability, shifting trade patterns, and inflationary pressure as global supply chains reorganize themselves around new centers of influence. These forces feel abstract when you encounter them in a news headline, distant events happening to distant people. But they arrive at your doorstep with startling precision, in the interest rate to your mortgage, in the price of fuel that determines the cost of everything transported to reach you, in the return generated or not generated by the modest retirement account you have been quietly contributing to for years without fully understanding what forces are actually shaping its growth or its stagnation. Given the sheer scale of these forces, national debt, currency policy, geopolitical realignment, it becomes reasonable to wonder whether individual choices matter at all anymore. And this is precisely where the story toward genuinely useful, because history offers a consistent and important lesson here. Systemic unfairness and individual opportunity are not contradictory forces canceling each other out. They exist together simultaneously, and the people who ultimately build security do not wait for the system to become fair before taking action. They learn to move intelligently within an imperfect system while everyone else waits for conditions that may never arrive. What actually separates the people who eventually escape that late-night dread from the people who continue experiencing it well into their 40s and 50s is rarely one dramatic decision. It is a set of unglamorous, quietly repeated behaviors, compounding patiently over long stretches of time. It is treating savings as a fixed obligation rather than whatever happens to be left over after spending, removing willpower from the equation entirely by automating the decision before temptation has a chance to interfere. It is understanding that debt is neither universally good nor universally dangerous, but a tool whose entire character depends on its purpose. Debt used to acquire something that generates income or appreciates in value behaves completely differently. Used to fund a lifestyle that depreciates the moment it is purchased, even though both types of debt look identical on a monthly statement. It is the quiet, repeated discipline of prioritizing ownership of productive assets over the temporary comfort of consumption, even when consumption is what everyone around you appears to be choosing. It would be dishonest, though, to end this story by suggesting that simply accumulating wealth solves the underlying anxiety completely, because that is not what the evidence actually shows. Some of the most dramatic financial collapses in recent memory have involved people by their early 30s appeared to have already won this game entirely, only to lose the overwhelming majority of what they built within a handful of years. This did not happen because they lacked intelligence. It happened because rapidly acquired wealth creates its own distinct psychological trap, an overconfidence that quietly convinces capable people they have mastered a system they have simply, temporarily, had favorable access to. Wealth built quickly, particularly wealth built on significant leverage, whose value depends entirely on continued market optimum, tends to be far more fragile than wealth built slowly through patient ownership of real, cash-generating assets. The lesson embedded inside these collapses is uncomfortable but essential. Financial security is never a permanent status you arrive at and then simply keep forever. It is an ongoing, active relationship with risk and your own psychology that requires continuous attention for as long as you are earning, saving, and investing. So return one final time to that quiet moment lying awake, doing math you did not intend to do, feeling something inside. The future you once assumed was coming may not actually be arriving on schedule. What genuinely changes after that moment is rarely a single dramatic action taken the following morning. It is a gradual shift in which questions you allow yourself to keep asking. Instead of repeatedly asking why the system feels stacked against you, a question with no productive answer, you begin asking which specific forces are actually working against you, and which specific decisions remain entirely within your own control, despite everything else. Instead of treating fear as a signal to freeze completely or to panic into reckless action, you begin recognizing fear as valuable information, sometimes information revealing genuine opportunity, precisely because everyone around you is reacting in the same predictable, fear-driven way. Instead of measuring your progress against an outdated story about guaranteed reward for effort, a story no longer accurately describes the economic world you actually live in, You begin constructing a new, more honest relationship with money, built on ownership rather than pure accumulation, patience rather than urgency, and genuine understanding rather than borrowed hope. None of this eliminates the very real structural pressures facing an entire generation, attempting to build financial security inside a world of rising asset prices, quiet currency erosion, and shifting global power dynamics. But it restores something nearly as valuable as comfort itself, a genuine sense of agency inside a moment that initially feels like the complete absence of it. The realization that the version of wealth you once imagined for yourself may never arrive is not, despite how it feels in that first cold moment, the end of your financial story. It is, if you allow it to be, the exact point where a more honest, more resilient, and ultimately more effective relationship with money finally has room to begin, provided you are willing to release the old story you inherited and start asking the harder, more useful questions in its place. And that leaves behind the real question this entire story has been quietly building toward, one considerably more unsettling than where we began. It is not simply whether you will ever become wealthy by the definition handed to you before you are old enough to question it. It is whether you can recognize, and resignation fully take hold, that the moment your old story about finally breaks is not a tragedy happening to you without your consent. It is information arriving at precisely the moment you needed it, revealing a system you were never properly taught to see, and a future that remains, despite every force working against it, considerably more within your control than it feels on the night you first suspect it might not be.